Good morning, I'm Chris Fox. Welcome to part 2 of my series on outlining your novel. So last time around we discussed coming up with your premise, and today we're going to talk about plot and character arcs. So for those unfamiliar with the 3-act model, which we'll get into in depth in the next video, there are several phases to how that works. So you start with an inciting incident, something that's interrupting the hero's world. And then you've got sort of a rising tension until you get to the climax of the novel, and then it ends and wraps up. And that arc is the main plot arc. Everything is built around that. So when we look at the arcs in the next part of this video, you're going to see which one is my main plot, and you're going to see the kind of the subplots. So each plot in your novel needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So for example, one of the plots that we'll see is the budding relationship between Catherine and Nolan. You have to look at how that evolves. Where does it start? Where does it end? And how does it get there? So really you're putting these dots down and connecting the dots, and that's the point of those arcs, which you'll see again in the next section. Before we get there, it is important to understand the difference between plot and character arcs. So every story ultimately is about characters, and it's about how those characters transform. You want somebody who is not the same person at the end of a story that they were at the beginning. They've learned and changed and grown in some way. And there's a whole branch of novels, often called character-driven novels, that focus on that really heavily. And then there's another brand of novels, and this is the type of brand I write, that are plot-driven. And so this is more about the events that are occurring in the story. And it's great that our characters are growing and evolving. They need to do this, but it's not the focal point of the story. So when you're building that framework, when I do it, I'm taking a more plot-based approach and then sort of, bolting the characters onto that. It's still important to have great characters. It's just really a choice of what you start with. And in my case, that's plot. So some great examples of plot-driven stories, the Dresden Files, Star Wars is another good one. So you can see that it is definitely an effective approach. I think it's probably enough detail to get started, so we're just going to go ahead and jump into the next section where I'm going to show you how I use the premise to come up with the plot and story arcs for the prequel, Exiled. Okay, we'll start by examining the plot arcs, since in my opinion, the way I approach stories, these are the more important of the two. So a lot of people believe that character-driven stories are the way to go. I know that Libby Hawker definitely takes that route and is very successful with it. So she would probably start with character arcs, but I am starting with plot. And what I did is I looked at my premise, and I tried to mine the major elements. What's going on here? What's going to be most important to the reader? What needs to be resolved by the end? And you're trying to find sort of the broad plot arcs that you need to define. And what I came up with is Catherine and Nolan. So we need to flesh out their relationship, and what I'm doing is plotting a beginning point and an end point, and then looking at what might happen in the middle to get from A to B. So you just need to know the beginning and the ending, and then you plot out the beats in this particular plot in the middle. So you can see this is very loosely defined because it's not the major plot. If we scroll down a little bit, you can see the next one is Admiral Mendez. So beginning point, you can see that he's the highly decorated veteran and the head of OFI, staunch supporter, great protagonist at the end, and now he's the true villain of the trilogy. So this is my chance to show him falling from grace, which means I can make this really powerful if I devote the right attention to it, and so that's what I'm trying to define here in these couple of paragraphs. And then down on the bottom, this is the main plot, and this is why it's so much larger. You can see me basically rewriting the premise here as this plot arc. And what this is going to allow me to do is form the 3-act structure that we're going to cover next week. So because I have all this written out, I'm going to look for specific parts. So I won't cover that here, we'll do that next week, but things like the inciting incident, the first doorway, they're going to be pulled from what we're creating here. Okay, so that's plot arcs. Character arcs, for me, they're a little more shallow because this is a prequel, because there's not a lot of room for development. It's very, very short. But they still need to be there. So for Nolan, at the beginning of the book, his comfort zone is working a command floor at OFI. He wants to work his way into the Admiralty and doesn't have any desire at all to be a fleet captain. By the end of the book, he's forced to pursue that as his only career path, and so he's going to have to grow as a person and realize that his future isn't in his control. So that's his arc. Catherine starts out resenting Nolan and being fiercely independent. By the end of the book, she really needs to get better at teamwork and shed her loner persona. So that's the change we're going to see in Catherine. And then Mendez is that tragic fall that we mentioned in the plot arc. We really need to show the reader what this does to him as a person so that the reader is sympathetic to Mendez. Even though he's the villain, they feel bad because he's doing this against his will. So between these plot arcs and these character arcs, what'll happen next is in the manuscript, we'll start dropping in chapters that correspond to each of these events. That's how we're going to do our actual outline. But for now, you don't need to worry about that. All you need to do is identify the major plot arcs and character arcs. And occasionally I'll run into a roadblock doing that. So what I'll do is take time to flesh out these characters, and artwork helps a ton. So this is Cortana from Halo. I liberally grabbed this image from Google. Mendez is exactly the same. I pulled him from Destroyer. I had already completed him, obviously, as a character. We've got Admiral Chu. Some new ones that I created, and I had a tremendous amount of fun with this, is Administrator Bach. He runs an asteroid mining facility, which will be important to the plot. You have Annie, who this is a picture of Annie Oakley. The reader may not get this because I'm not going to give a last name, but I'm modeling this Annie character after Annie Oakley, and she carries around a shotgun, and she's, a hard as nails asteroid miner. So I think she'll be a lot of fun to write. Catherine hasn't really changed from Destroyer, neither has Nolan. I also added the bad guys. So here's our antagonist. We've got Bruce Raid, PhD. He looks very mad scientist-y. I've got, sort of his background defined here because really we need to understand what it is Dr. Reed is all about in order to kind of craft the ultimate villain. And then here's the villain that we're going to be rooting for. This is Delta. So Delta was originally an OFI officer. He's been converted against his will. His arms were chopped off and replaced, so were other parts of his body. And so he's kind of unwittingly serving Reed because he has no choice. So this is going to be the window that we get into the plot. So we're not going to do point of view chapters from Dr. Reed. We're going to do them from Delta. So this is kind of the vehicle our reader will have into the antagonist side of the story. And in coming up with these, it sort of informed more of how the plot was going to go. So I didn't just do a list of characters. I would do a little bit of the character arc, make another character, then do part of the plot arc, make another character. And so this is all very organically growing. But you can now see that I've got a complete cast of characters. I understand what I'm trying to do with my plot. And the next phase of what we're going to do for outlining is the 3-act structure. So we're going to start dropping in scene placeholders until we've built a skeletal framework of scenes that go from the beginning of the novel to the end. And then in the last part of these videos, we're actually going to write the descriptions for each of those chapters so you can sort of see the final fleshing out of the plot. Anyway, I hope these videos are proving to be useful. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask them in the comments. If you really like the video, definitely subscribe. There will be more of the same coming, or sign up to the mailing list.